The first time Thomas held his grandfather's axe, he was only 7 years old. It was an old tool with an oak handle worn by time and the sweat of generations, the blade still sharp despite 60 years of use. Grandfather Henry had placed the tool in the boy's small hands with a solemnity that Thomas didn't fully understand at the time, but which he would carry with him forever. "This axe belonged to my father, and to his father before him," Henry said, his hoarse voice carrying the weight of decades of stories. "One day it will be yours. But an axe isn't just steel and wood, Tommy. It's responsibility." They were in the forest surrounding the family's small property on the outskirts of Timber Falls, Oregon, a town that had once prospered in the days of the lumber industry, but now subsisted on modest tourism and the stubbornness of families like theirs who refused to abandon the land their ancestors had cultivated. The forest was dense, with Douglas firs rising like columns of a green cathedral, their branches filtering the sunlight in golden beams that danced across the moss-covered ground and pine needles. Thomas grew up with the weight of that unspoken promise. While other boys dreamed of leaving Timber Falls for the big cities, he found peace among the trees. His father, Robert, had tried his luck in Portland for a few years, working in stifling offices until news of Henry's frail health brought him back. Robert never fully adjusted to the return, always with a distant look that suggested part of him was still clinging to that other life. But Thomas was different. For him, the forest wasn't a prison, it was a sanctuary. At 16, Thomas already knew every trail, every stream, every clearing in that forest, as well as he knew the lines of his own hand. He knew where the deer came to drink water at dawn, where the owls nested, where the wind whispered loudest through the branches. And he knew, with the instinctive certainty that comes only from true belonging, that this place was as much a part of him as he was a part of it. It was in the autumn of his 17th year that everything began to change. Henry had passed away the previous spring, departing peacefully in his sleep, and Thomas inherited the axe as promised. But along with the axe came something he hadn't expected. News that a lumber company had bought the neighboring properties and was making increasingly generous offers for the family land. "That's a lot of money, Tommy," his father said one night, papers scattered across the kitchen table. The dim light from the lamp hanging above the table cast deep shadows under his eyes. "We could start over. You could go to college, any college you wanted. I could do something different." Thomas looked at the axe hanging on the wall next to the fireplace. "And the forest?" Robert followed his son's gaze. "It's not our entire forest, Tommy, just 10 acres. They promise sustainable logging and replanting. It wouldn't be like it used to be. But it would be cut. Trees grow back. Not those trees. Not those pine trees that your great-grandfather watched grow. Not that oak tree where your grandmother hung the swing for you when you were a child." Robert sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. "It's not that simple, son. Not when there are bills to pay and a future to think about." But for Thomas, it was exactly that simple. That night, he picked up his axe and walked into the forest under the moonlight. Not to cut, but to feel. He sat in a clearing he had known since childhood, axe in his lap, and listened. The wind in the leaves, the rustling of small animals in the darkness, the distant hoot of an owl, and for the first time since his grandfather's death, he wept. The tears weren't just for Henry, he realized. They were for the fear of losing that place, that connection to something bigger than himself. They were for the frustration of not being able to make his father understand. They were for the weight of being the last guardian of a promise that might be impossible to keep. When he returned home at dawn, he found his father waiting on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "I thought you might need this," said Robert, handing over a cup. They drank in silence for a long moment, watching the sun rise over the trees, painting the sky pink and gold. "I haven't sold it," Robert finally said. "Not yet. But Tommy, you need to understand that keeping this land, it's not easy. The taxes go up every year. The sawmill closed. There's no work here. I want to give you a better future." "This is my better future," Thomas replied, pointing to the forest. "This here." Robert looked at his son, really looked, and for the first time in years, he seemed to see him. Not the boy he remembered, but the young man Thomas had become. And in his son's face, he saw the same kind of quiet determination that his own father had always possessed. "Then show me," Robert said. "Show me why it's worth fighting for." Over the following weeks, Thomas took his father into the forest in ways he never had before. Not just casual walks, but purposeful journeys. He showed his father places where water sprang clean from the earth, where rare plants grew, where the family's history was etched into the landscape in ways no document could record. He led Robert to an old tree that had initials carved into its trunk, now almost healed by time. "Grandpa Henry brought me here once. He said these are his and Grandma Martha's initials from when they were young, 52 years before I was born." Robert ran his fingers over the faded marks, his expression changing. Thomas showed him a hidden valley where his great-grandfather had built a small stone dam, still functional, still diverting water to what had once been a small mill. He fed 3 families with that mill, ours and the Johnsons and Weatherbys. They're gone, but his work remains. Day after day, Thomas wove a tapestry of stories and places, reconnecting his father to the land Robert had emotionally abandoned so long ago. And slowly, something began to change in Robert. The stiffness in his shoulders lessened. His distant gaze became more present. It was during one of these walks that they found the fallen tree. It was an immense Douglas fir, probably 200 years old, that had been felled by a recent storm. Its enormous root system was exposed, a tangle of roots stretching for meters. "What a waste," Robert muttered. But Thomas shook his head. "No, it isn't. Look." He knelt beside the fallen log and pointed. Fungi were already beginning to colonize the wood, small green shoots sprouting from the rotting trunk. A squirrel scurried along the fallen log, clearly using it as a new highway through the forest. "A fallen tree is not the end," Thomas explained. "It's the beginning of something new. It will nourish the soil for decades. It will shelter animals. It will let in light so that young trees can grow. The forest knows what to do." Robert remained silent for a long time, looking at the fallen tree with new eyes. "Your grandfather tried to teach me this," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "But I was too busy looking into the distance to see what was right in front of me." That night, Robert burned the lumber company papers in the fireplace. But the decision brought new challenges. Without the sale of the land, they needed to find a way to sustain it. Thomas had an idea. He had read about conservation programs, about how landowners could receive financial support to preserve natural habitats. There was also a growing interest in ecotourism, in authentic experiences away from the cities. "We can share this," he told his father. "Not sell it, not destroy it, but share it. Guided walks, environmental education. Show people what you see now." The idea seemed impossible at first, but Thomas was persistent. He went to the library, spent hours on the school internet researching grant programs and conservation initiatives. He wrote letters, made calls, filled out forms. The answer came months later, in the form of a small grant from an environmental organization and interest from a nearby university that wanted to use the property as a field study site. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a start. With the arrival of spring, Thomas and Robert began preparing trails, creating signs, and documenting the flora and fauna. They were not alone. As news spread through Timber Falls, others joined them. The Johnsons, whose ancestors had been helped by Thomas's great-grandfather, came to assist. Mrs. Chen, a teacher at the local school, volunteered to bring classes on field trips. Even some of the unemployed loggers showed up, their experience in the forest finding a new purpose. The first group of visitors arrived on a rainy Saturday in April. It was a group of university biology students, and Thomas was nervous as he led them along the trails he had known all his life. But when he began to speak, the words flowed naturally. He spoke about the ecosystem, about the relationships between the trees and the soil, about how each element of the forest depended on the others. He spoke about history, about his great-grandfather and the mill, about his grandmother and the swing, about Henry and the lessons he had taught. The students were fascinated. They asked questions, took photos, and took notes. A young woman named Sarah stayed behind while the group moved on. "I grew up in Seattle," she told Thomas. "Skyscrapers and concrete. I'd forgotten places like that still existed. Thank you for protecting it." His words stayed with Thomas. He realized that what he was doing wasn't just about preserving his family's land, but about maintaining a refuge for all who needed to reconnect with something real, something deeper than the rush of modern life. Summer brought more visitors. Families with children, photographers, bird watchers, people simply seeking peace. Thomas guided each group with the same passion, and slowly the word spread. Articles appeared in small local newspapers, then in larger publications. A popular travel blogger visited and wrote about the magical hidden forest in Oregon that you need to experience. With the increase in visitors came an increase in income, modest but steady. More importantly, came validation. Thomas's choice to fight for the forest was making a difference not only for him, but for countless others. But it wasn't all easy. There were conflicts in the town. Some saw Thomas as a naive idealist, hindering progress. The lumber company, frustrated by Robert's refusal to sell, began operations on neighboring properties, and the sound of chainsaws echoed through Thomas's forest like a constant threat. One morning, Thomas woke up to the sound of machinery very close by. He ran to the edge of his property and found a cutting crew that had clearly crossed onto his side of the line. "Stop!" he shouted. "You're in my land!" The foreman, a large, middle-aged man with a yellow helmet, walked up to him. "This is a mistake, boy. Go home." "It's not a mistake," Thomas said firmly. "You crossed the property line. I know every inch of this forest." There was a tense moment when Thomas thought the man might simply ignore him, but then the foreman sighed and looked around, checking his maps. His expression changed. "Damn it," he muttered. "You're right, Johnson. Back off the line. We're on Whitmore property." As the team repositioned themselves, the foreman looked at Thomas with what might have been respect. "You're the kid doing that conservation work, right?" Thomas nodded, still tense. "My son came along on one of his school walks," the man said. "He hasn't stopped talking about it. It's the first time I've seen him excited about something in months." He paused. "Look, kid, I'm just doing my job. But I'm glad someone is trying to salvage a piece of this." Thomas watched the team drive away, the roar of the chainsaws resuming at a safe distance. He sat on a fallen log, his grandfather's old axe in his hands. The blade was stained now, not with the blood of trees, but with the honest rust of a tool that was held but rarely used for its original purpose. "Is that what you meant, Grandpa?" he murmured to himself. "When I said an axe was a responsibility, not about cutting, but about choosing when not to cut." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of sap and earth and burgeoning life, and Thomas had his answer. The year passed. The conservation project grew. Thomas graduated from high school with a scholarship offer to study forest management, which he accepted, dividing his time between university and the property. Robert, in turn, found new life as co-manager of the conservation, his business experience proving valuable in unexpected ways. It was during the second year of the operation that Sarah, the student from Seattle, returned. She was doing her thesis on forest ecosystems and asked permission to conduct research on the property. Thomas agreed, and over the months, as Sarah established her research sites and data collection points, they became friends. Then something more. Sarah viewed the forest with the eyes of a scientist, but also with the heart of a poet. She could explain the mycorrhiza and the networks of fungi that connected the trees, but she also marveled at the simple beauty of sunlight filtering through the morning mist. "Do you know what's special about this place?" she said to Thomas one afternoon as they sat in their favorite clearing. "It's not just the forest, it's the history. With every step, you can feel the generations that walked here before. It's like walking through time." Thomas took her hand. "I always knew I was special. I just didn't know how to make other people understand." "You are doing it," Sarah smiled. "Every person who walks these trails comes out changed. Maybe just a little, but changed. This is something real." That night, as they walked back, Thomas took Sarah to the tree with her grandparents' initials on it. "Henry and Martha, 52 years before I was born," he said, tracing the worn letters. Then, taking out a small penknife, he carefully began to add new initials below the old ones. TW plus SC. Sarah watched, tears glistening in her eyes. "Are you sure?" "More certain than anything else in my life." The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Summers of golden light and the laughter of children discovering their first squirrels. Autumns of burning leaves and fresh air. Winters of silent snow, transforming the forest into a world of crystal. Springs of rebirth and green promise. Conservation flourished. Other nearby landowners, inspired by Thomas's success, started their own programs, creating a protected habitat corridor. The town of Timber Falls slowly began to reinvent itself, not as a logging center, but as a destination for those seeking authenticity and connection with nature. Thomas and Sarah were married under the canopy of ancient trees, with Robert by their side and half the town in attendance. The old axe hung with flowers on the tree where they had exchanged vows, a symbol transformed from destruction into protection. 3 years later, when Sarah gave birth to a baby girl, they named her Martha, after Thomas's grandmother. And when little Martha was just a few weeks old, Thomas took her to the forest, walking along the same trails his grandfather had walked with him. He sat in the clearing, his daughter in his arms, and spoke to her about the forest, knowing she was too young to understand, but wanting her to hear his voice mingled with the whisper of the trees from the very beginning. "One day," he said softly, "you will understand that we are part of something bigger. These trees were here before us and will be here after us if we take care of them. We are not their owners. We are their guardians." Martha looked at him with large, dark eyes, her small hand closing around his finger, and Thomas felt the weight of generations, of past responsibility and future promises. When Martha turned 7, Thomas was ready. On a clear spring day, he picked up the old axe, now over 70 years old, and walked with his daughter into the forest. "This axe belonged to my grandfather and to his father before him," he said, echoing the words Henry had told him so many years ago. "One day it will be yours. But an axe isn't just steel and wood, Martha. It's responsibility." Martha touched the worn cable reverently. "What should I do with it, Dad?" Thomas knelt beside her, gazing at the surrounding trees, the green moss and golden rays of sunlight, at all the wild and ancient beauty they had protected. "You choose," he said. "Each generation must choose, but no matter what you choose, remember, every action has consequences, every cut leaves a mark, and some things, once lost, can never be recovered." Martha nodded earnestly, then looked at her father with the same determined eyes he once had. "Then I choose to protect her, like you, like Grandpa Henry, like Great-Grandpa." Thomas felt his throat tighten. Even if it's difficult? Even when other people don't understand? Especially then. Martha replied. He embraced her, this tiny human being who already understood what many adults would never learn. And as he held her, he looked over his head at the forest, at the trees, silent witnesses to so many human stories, and felt something that could only be described as peace. Conservation would continue, new challenges would arise. There were always threats, always those who saw the forest only as resources to be extracted. But there would also be guardians. Generation after generation, as long as there were people willing to fight, the forest would remain. Thomas thought of his grandfather, of how Henry had seen something in that 7-year-old boy that justified passing on not just a tool, but a mission. He thought of his father, Robert, who had gotten lost but found his way back. He thought of Sarah, who had brought science and poetry to his understanding of the forest. And he thought of Martha, now holding the old axe with reverence, her eyes shining with promise. They walked deeper into the forest that day, father and daughter, and Thomas showed her the secret places, the hidden streams, the ancient trees. He spoke of history and responsibility, of choices and consequences. And Martha listened, truly listened, in the way that only children who grow up with a sense of belonging to something greater can listen. As night fell, when they returned, they found Sarah waiting on the porch with Robert, both watching the sunset paint the sky red and gold above the treetops. "How was it?" Sarah asked. Thomas looked at Martha, who was still carefully holding the axe. "That was perfect," Robert smiled, his eyes shining. "Is she ready?" "Not yet," said Thomas, "but she will be, as I was, as you became. The forest teaches us patience, among other things." That night, the old axe returned to its place on the wall beside the fireplace. The blade was dull now, more rust than steel, the handle smooth from decades of hands holding it. But it was more precious than ever, because it had become more than a tool. It was a symbol of choices made, battles fought, loves shared, and lessons learned. The trees outside whispered in the night wind, their ancient voices singing songs of time and permanence. And inside the house, a family rested, knowing they had honored the past and protected the future, knowing that when dawn came, the forest would still be there, waiting, permanent, eternal. An axe, a forest, and the people who learned that the greatest act of courage is not cutting, but preserving, not conquering, but protecting, not possessing, but belonging. And through generations, through time, the story would continue. Because some stories are not just told, they are lived. And some forests are not just saved by one person, but by an unbroken chain of hands, passing on not just a tool, but a promise. The promise is that as long as there are those who care, who fight, who choose preservation over easy profit, there will be hope. And as long as there is hope, there will be forests where light filters through the leaves, where the wind sings ancient songs, where children can learn that they are part of something much bigger than themselves. This was the legacy of an axe that learned not to cut, of a forest that taught generations to see beyond the immediate, of a family that discovered that true wealth lies not in how much you possess, but in how much you protect. And on quiet nights, when Martha had grown up and had children of her own, she would take the old axe from the wall and tell them about great-grandfather Henry, about grandfather Thomas, about the choice each generation had to make. And her children would touch the worn handle and understand, as generations before them had understood, that they were not just guardians of a forest, but of a promise that would echo through time. Whenever someone chose preservation instead of destruction, love instead of greed, the future instead of the immediate present. And the forest, a silent witness to all of this, would continue to grow, its roots deep, its branches reaching for the sky, a living monument to the power of right choices and quiet courage.